Wow. Just rolled credits on Gears 5, and man, there's a lot to digest here. I want to do a video talking about the single player campaign. I will do another video at some point in the future talking about my thoughts on multiplayer. I will be getting into spoilers. If you have not yet played Gears 5, turn this video off, come back to it later. You owe it to yourself to play through this entire campaign spoiler free and go through the highs and lows as everyone else has, because the Coalition has done a phenomenal job of putting this game together, and I don't want to ruin it for you guys. So turn this video off, and for everybody else, you're still here because either you have beat Gears 5 or you really just don't care about Gears at all and you're just curious what I think about it. So here we go. I loved everything about Gears 5. I definitely think this was a true reinvigoration of the franchise. Even though Gears 4 was under the Coalition's watch, it really wasn't until this edition of Gears did the franchise really rise up into a phenomenal experience. Now, I have been a Gears head since the beginning of time. I've always talked about how I cut my teeth on multiplayer with Gears 3. That was my first really big Xbox experience, and I sank hundreds and hundreds of hours into Horde mode with my friends. Had an absolute blast with that game. And Judgment, I'm not going to talk about that game because it stunk. Gears 4, even though it introduced some new characters, they largely fell flat. I mean, it was definitely overshadowed by the greats of Marcus and of Baird and of Coltrane and all those wonderful people. But Gears 5 breaks the mold entirely, finally puts Kate front and center, and we get a phenomenal story, not just about her, but about Del and about JD and about Foz. And you really start to connect with these characters in a way that you didn't connect with the characters of the old guard. Maybe except for Marcus, solely because Marcus was the guy and there was enough story beats through Gears 1, 2, and 3 to kind of cobble together who he really was. But really, outside of him, everybody else was always one-dimensional. And it isn't until this game did they get the writing correct. And they made you care about JD, and they made you care about Del and Foz and Kate front and center, and this journey that she goes through. So I loved the campaign solely for the story. Even if it was told in a different manner, I think I would have been fascinated with it. We did see a lot of heartache, and I think the best way to kind of walk through my thoughts on everything is to kind of run through the story. So we knew that at the end of Gears 4, based on the medallion that Kate was wearing, she was somehow related to Queen Mira. She somehow had that Locust or Horde blood inside of her, and we find out, in this game that she is having a hard time keeping herself together. She's starting to have very weird visions of what is going on in the world. She's getting like flashes, almost these like Borg-like flashes of, the Swarm and this. I think I kind of draw comparisons to the Lich King and World of Warcraft, and how there always must be a Lich King. There must always be somebody to control the armies of the damned, in this case, the Horde, which we kind of knew were somewhat genetically engineered by humanity years ago, kind of splintered off. Even though they were put down, they were never defeated, and they just start rising back up, and they need an evil force to keep them alive. And even though Queen Mira is gone, it is now Kate's mother who's taken the reins and has become Queen Rey. She is now the basic queen of the Locust, and she's lost her humanity, and she's just driven by this hate for humanity now to destroy everything. And it follows Kate going off, basically AWOL through most of the game, trying to figure out what's going on and how to fight these skirmishes along the way to quell this demon, this demon locust horde that's rising up. The pacing of the game, I think, at times was a little off. There's definitely a lot of enter a room, there's nobody, press a button and or do a thing, and then the waves of enemies appear. And that really is a consistent beat up until Act 4, where it's all balls to the wall. And I don't expect a game to keep that frantic pace all the way. You know, like if you took Act 4 and you like backtracked it to all the way to Act 1. I do think this game warrants some exploration. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. Everything about it looks wonderful. I loved walking around and exploring, finding different collectibles, reading more about the lore, because it does inject a lot of backstory into this game that I think makes it even better in terms of writing. However, there was definitely a lot of times where it was too much walking and not enough shooting. Then you'd have a very small extreme skirmish that would last 2 to 3 minutes, and that'd be it. And then you'd go back to walking or exploring again. So I applaud the Coalition for implementing some exploration and implementing a definite restructure of the game. I think they maybe dialed it a little bit too much in the exploration side, and I'd like to see more sense of urgency moment to moment, because you really don't feel it a lot when you're walking around aimlessly in these giant empty rooms for 5, 10, 15 minutes sometimes without ever pulling the trigger. What I also liked about this was all the different places you go. So very quickly we realized that in order to defeat the demons, we have to reassemble the Hammer of Dawn satellites. And to do so, we have to go back to the UIR. Now the UIR, for those of you who aren't really familiar with Gears lore, long ago, before Gears 1, there was this war called the Pendulum Wars. And they do talk about it from time to time in the games. It's definitely detailed a lot in the comics. The Gears 3 DLC follows a lot of people who are heavily involved in that war as well. But basically, it was a turmoil when the COG and the UIR fought. And it was these two opposing factions of government. And ultimately, the COG reigns supreme. That's why everything's COG going from Gears 1 beyond. But the UIR had quite an army behind them as well. And it turns out that even though most of the COG settlements have been destroyed because of this pretty much never-ending war with the zombie locusts, well, not really zombies, but, you know, almost think of them as zombies. It's just never-ending threat. The UIR base is largely abandoned and forgotten, and a lot of the game focuses on you traveling through these other bases, reassembling technologies from there to basically assemble a super weapon in order to refight and re-engage and try to take the battle back to the forefront. And you do that through a lot of exploration, which is really a Gears first. And we also are introduced to optional side quests, also a Gears first. I think largely they work. The problem is because of Gears' limited moveset, which is really limited to cover-based fire and a roadie run, there's really not a lot in terms of exploration or puzzle solving. And I know a lot of people have given strong criticisms to Uncharted because they say Uncharted is just a lot of climbing and shooting. But I think that sense of verticality really separates that game from a game like Gears 5. Both of them had a lot of optional exploration and puzzles and challenges to solve, but definitely I think Gears falls on the shorter end of this because there isn't a lot of abilities that you have other than shooting the occasional thing to set off some sort of Rube Goldberg chain reaction to get through a puzzle, or sending Jack off to do something. Jack off. To do something. The reality of it, though, is that the exploration is limited to going into a room, pressing a button, and defending Jack while he hacks into a thing, or walking into a building empty and then fighting your way back out. It was fun. I appreciated it. It did add a little bit of depth, and I think what helps it so much is that you have a lot of side banter during these, so depending on who your squad is at the time, and it does vary from the act to act, having some of that side banter with different characters, I think helps a lot, and it does flesh out the characters quite a bit instead of everybody just in complete silence. And you do get some nice upgrades for Jack as well, and you do get to explore a little bit of the world and see things kind of in a different light. There's some mysteries to solve. What happened to these people trying to replenish water for this old base, that sort of thing. But outside of those brief moments of exploration, there's really no incentive to do anything outside of the main story, largely because upgrading Jack, who is supposed to be your eye in the sky, I didn't use him very much. I didn't even use half the components that I found for him, which are scattered everywhere, very, very easy to find. You're going to find an ability you like, you're going to stick to it. I like the mind control one. I didn't always use it though, but when I did, it was very effective. Maybe people played this game very differently and relied on Jack a lot more than I did, but I didn't find his presence that important in the single player story. And a lot of times I would see treasures, I'd go collect them because they were nearby, but I never finished assigning points to Jack, and I never tried to upgrade him entirely. And I didn't really feel that it was that important because you are going to be bombarded with weapons and guns. And especially since you can store guns on your vehicle now, you're always going to have a mulcher or a tri-shot or a salvo, the RL4 salvo rocket pods ready to go at a moment's notice. And ammo is littered everywhere. You're never, ever going to have a problem with ammunition. So that exploration ultimately nets something that isn't quite used so much, at least from my perspective. So it wasn't like, oh my God, I need to really get Jack really powerful and he's going to help me out. I didn't really care. I was more interested in the lore pieces, the posters, the books, the manuals, transcripts, that sort of thing that did flesh out the universe. I did like that, and I thought that was very beneficial to the story, as I mentioned. So talked a little bit about the pacing, which I thought was a bit off. Talked about the exploration, which was cool, but it didn't really net everything. But it all wraps together under beautiful gameplay and a beautiful story arc that really keeps you motivated to continue. And characters, our beloved JD, this White Knight in the first game, definitely has some problems in this game. And you could see him really kind of struggling with his role in this, as so much so that he breaks off from the group. We assume he's dead, but we kind of know he's not going to be dead when that truck explodes. And I'll jump back in a second to walk through the story plot. But, seeing JD, come and go was kind of a shock. And I think that's what really set the tone for me, at least in this game, that things were going to be different. So walking through the story a bit, I kind of saved that a little bit later on in this video, only because there's a lot of thoughts rolling through my head that I wanted to get out early. And walking through the story is kind of simple in the sense that it's about that UIR technology. So it's going to be Del and it's going to be Kate plus somebody helping you. Sometimes it's Marcus, sometimes it's Foz, JD. The Cole Train joins the party for a little bit. You have Carmine a little mixed in there too. You have Lizzie. Different characters come and go that assist along the way. And very early on in the game, Kate establishes that she's a renegade and she's going to go AWOL almost immediately. So a lot of that stuff with the DBs and the prime minister, that woman, doesn't really pan into this. You kind of go off and do your own thing. And I'm guessing because there's such a big war going on, they don't really have time to kind of court-martial you. I'm guessing because they basically give you the ability to just come and go as you want. And it doesn't really make sense in terms of a structured military. You wouldn't think of something like, even in Halo, for example, the Master Chief's constantly calling back to command like, hey, I want to go do this. I want to go do this. Is that okay? Is that okay? In this game, you're like ripping your comms out. You're like, we're going to do our own thing. And you just go off and have your own adventure. And it's weird that the game is so structured in this military, and they're very, who's in charge here, and Foz is the corporal, and I'm in charge, and Sergeant Mark is here, sir, and a lot of that just kind of falls by the wayside early on in the game when Kate goes AWOL, and I guess they just think that's okay. I thought that was a little weird, especially towards the end when you kind of reunite with the army, and it's like, oh, hey, Kate's back, cool, let's help out again. It didn't really flow that well to me, but minute to minute, you're not going to be thinking about that because you're going to be exploring this world with Kate and Del, working around reassembling this rocket. And very early on, there's a very gut-wrenching scene in which Kate starts to lose control of herself, and she is getting flashes and able to possess some of the other enemies for a brief period of time. I thought they would use this mechanic more. It was purely as a gimmick storytelling device. It ended as quick as it started. I would have liked to see that explored a little bit more in the story, but it wasn't. Basically, Kate has this ability, which she turns off somehow, and maybe by killing the matriarch or just by not thinking about it anymore. But for a brief while, she can control some of the swarm. So immediately, I'm turning the swarm against each other and shooting each other, as I'm jumping through character to character, ultimately working my way up and watching our beloved Uncle Oscar getting killed while you are controlling, kind of alluding to the fact that you did it, even though you weren't really pressing any of the buttons on the controller per se, that Kate was basically possessing the monster that killed her uncle, which is sad. I really liked him. I thought he was a great character in Gears 4. He was definitely a rough, kind of tough guy who, came up at the same time Marcus and all those guys did, kind of takes Kate under his wing. And he has a pretty quick demise, which was shocking to me because he was such a pivotal character. Really thinking back to the Gears franchise, you could really only count deaths on one hand. Obviously, Dom was very upsetting. You had the Carmine brothers, the A and B Carmine, so to speak. Clayton stays alive, and he's prominently featured towards the end of this campaign. You had Ty kill himself with the shotgun, and you had Dom's suicide, or martyrdom, whatever you want to call it. Not really a lot of deaths, though. There's probably a few other ancillary characters in them that don't matter as much. I mean, you could mention Marcus's dad, I guess. But the truth is, most of the characters make it. So right off the bat, getting a death like that, pretty interesting. And I felt like that was really set this game apart in terms of like a darker tone. So Kate goes off to find herself. She takes Del along, working her way through the ice initially, finding out what's kind of the backstory of her her grandmother's existence. A lot of creepy old spooky labs, working her way through a lot of Frozen. Frozen is definitely the theme. A lot of cool effects with the ice, and we see a lot of the collector edition stuff and merchandise focuses on this ice theme. So very prominently featured. Ultimately, we discover that just like we thought, an evil scientist was up to no good, kind of was poking around with Mira when she was a baby and kind of turns her into this monster. She gets pissed, she learns about her control, and she basically overthrows the Masters. It's about as simple as that. I wish there was some deep, dark revelation in there. There really wasn't. Kind of unfortunate, kind of a letdown, only because we kind of knew that already playing through Gears 3, particularly with the work that Marcus's dad was involved in, but okay. So at least Kate has some closure now on what needs to be done. She eliminates this matriarch, which kind of severs her connection to the Horde. However, she's aware that there's still her mother's presence out there, which is still collecting and building up this army of evil. And that's where the game jumps into the third act, where we have to assemble the Hammer of Dawn super weapon, putting together a rocket and satellites in order to build up this ultimate weapon to destroy the Horde. That's where we're reintroduced with JD and Foz. We find out that JD wasn't killed after all, though he's got some really nasty burns on his arm. Foz has some redemptive qualities. He's not as much of a jerk as we thought he was. They accompany you, and you're finally in a pretty cool 4-man plus Jack, so kind of like a 5-person squad for most of Act 3. And it's cool because you can just tell how much more powerful you are as a player when you have this really tight squad behind you. And working along with UIR Paddock, who from the UIR, that wasn't his rank. I think he's a corporal maybe. Basically one of the old timers who reluctantly is an acceptance of the COG, but still remembers those old days and still has the fight in him. You basically assemble this rocket, and you launch it into outer space, which turns on these Hammer of Dawn and sets up for the final act. I glance over the third portion of the game because it kind of did slog a little bit to me. You're basically driving around different parts of this environment, slowly assembling pieces of the rocket, the nose cone, and the satellites. But it really is a lot of attack and defend, and there's really no major character revelations there. Del gets a lot more story time, which is good. We find out more about kind of his past, although he doesn't really talk about his parents too much. He's definitely a bookworm. He's definitely very intelligent. You really cement that relationship between Del and Kate in Act 3, and I think that's really, really important, at least it was for me, because after the rocket is assembled, we jump to Act 4, and that's when all hell breaks loose, and that's where I think most people are going to agree that the game is turned up from a 10 to like a 30 at this point. Constant run and gun, constant firing, back in the city now. The COG is on full defensive as you're reassembling these satellites to, these targeting satellites, these beacons basically down at ground level to shoot the Hammer of Dawn. And that's when you start getting some really, really fun engagements, reminiscent of Gears 1, when locust holes are pouring up everywhere and it's just a nonstop assault of Brumax and Swarmax and the swarms that fly around, the locust swarms. Constant grubs just pouring out of the ground and swarmers and everything, and it's really, really cool. Very early on in the act, you realize that you're losing this war. And Cole's in the power armor trying to help out that giant, mech suit that we saw prominently displayed at the end of Gears 4. We actually got to pilot it very briefly. Baird is back at his lab trying to get these satellites up and running, and you're with Marcus and the crew basically trying to reassemble these defense grids. And that's when you are reunited with your mother, who is wildly transformed at this point, has weird crystals and spikes growing all out of her body, and she's got these long tentacles, and she's always one step ahead of you. And it breaks down to this really pivotal moment. It's just like just a shock to me, where she's holding both basically Del and JD. And then the game prompts you, who will you save? I mean, even now I'm getting just goosebumps thinking about it. It's like, what do you mean, who will I save? I mean, and you're holding a knife. Why you don't throw the knife at her head to try to save them both? I don't know. I guess it's a plot device. You have to choose. And it turns out the character you don't save does die. I chose to save Del, even though I love Marcus and I love JD. I felt Kate would probably have saved Del because of what they had gone through. That's why I mentioned I feel Act 2 was so important and Act 3 was so important, because it really cements that bond and that forge between Del and Kate, because a lot of Act 2 you are completely alone. So I chose to save Del, and the evil queen snaps JD's neck and he dies right there in front of you. You grab his dog tags and you head off. Now, the game does diverge slightly at this point. I have gone back and played the other way, and yes, Del could die and JD would be saved. You save yourself the heartache of watching Marcus realizing his son is gone, holding his son's dog tags and just looking down. It's sad. If you save Del, if you save JD, he's still in shock that his buddy Del's gone. He can't believe this is happening. This war is very real and traumatic. He's lost a lot of people too. Either way, someone's going to die, and it's sad. It's just the way it is. Foz definitely takes both deaths equally as hard. Marcus takes both deaths equally as hard, and Kate has a hard time. Definitely a little mental breakdown there. And it's sad. It really is. But phenomenal writing. I'm curious what this means for Gears 6 and beyond, if there is a canon ending, or if we're just not going to play with Del or JD anymore, so it just doesn't matter. I can't imagine that's the case. It's a very tight-knit group. So I'll be very curious how they paint themselves into this corner, what they're going to do with Kate's next adventure. Ultimately, you save the day. The hammers come back online. Jack the robot sacrifices himself. by allowing himself to be a targeting beacon for the Hammer of Dawn. You blow up the big bad, and it seems that there's somewhat of a rest in the war. The war is somewhat over, even though we know the Queen is out there rebuilding her forces once again. The city that you are part of is an absolute shambles, with Kate, a renewed vigor, ripping the pendant off her neck, saying, basically, we're going to go on the offensive now. The game ends. You don't get a lot of Kate's story, though. That's the problem. You don't get any resolution of her. Everything was basically up to this point, and really, I think most of us could have already guessed what was going to happen. We knew that Queen Myrrah was kind of genetically engineered. They already talked about that in Gears 3. We didn't forget. So that wasn't a major revelation. Her mom taking the reins, that was very interesting. Her connection, her being Kate, connection via the matriarch to the Locust, very interesting, but not really played out particularly when you sever that connection early on in Act 2, or I'm sorry, at the end of Act 2. So you're left with one of these experiences like, it was good, it was great. The graphics were phenomenal, the sound was phenomenal, the gameplay was phenomenal, exploration, weapons, all these things really line up. And all this great polish, which I'll talk about in a second, that really just cements the whole experience. But then you have to take a step back and say, well, what really happened here? And really a lot of nothing. That's my biggest complaint with the game. At the end of the day, we now know that Kate now knows who she is and what her role is. We know her mother has kind of stepped into the reins, and it's going to be up to her mother to take over. But we also know that Marcus killed Queen Myrrah at the end of Gears 3, and the Locust still rises back up. So cutting the head off the snake doesn't necessarily end the war, so to speak. It doesn't really just fix everything. So this die hard, we have to get in there, we have to finish the Queen once and for all. I'm not really entirely sure if I could get on board with that message again in Gears 6. I think I'm going to need a little bit more to kind of carry the story through, because it just kind of ends. And there's not really there's definitely emotional impact. There's no like definitive story of like, okay, you think of like the way you felt at the end of like Gears 2. That's we're kind of in the middle, right? We know there's going to be more. I don't know if this is a trilogy or not, but we need more, and it just kind of ends. And that, I wasn't a big fan of that. Seeing Marcus go through what he went through, him still being around, I'm curious to see what his role will be going forward. Coltrane, definitely old and gray, but still a total badass. One of my favorite characters of this franchise. Carmine still going, although it looks like his cousin Lizzie does not make it. Clearly, I thought she was going to be kind of a fan favorite. Total badass at the beginning. She, I assume, is dead from that explosion at the beginning of the game. Never confirmed. But, yeah, so that's my thoughts on the story. So much polish went into this game. That's what I want to kind of close this video on. Because I don't want it to make it seem like I don't like this game. I do. It's definitely it's a great shot of blood into the arm of an otherwise flailing series. Let's be honest. Gears 4 was okay. It wasn't great. I think Gears 3 was so phenomenal just because it was just such a bro shooter. It worked for Gears 3. Gears 4 definitely played itself out. Gears 5, a nice new reimagining. We have a lot to work with going in the future. But I think the overall tone is just, phenomenal moment-to-moment gameplay, phenomenal moment-to-moment graphics and sound. And the polish in this game it's beautiful. I've never seen a game that lets you carry your weapons throughout the entire game. I picked up a Retro Lancer very early on in the game. I never put it down. Every cutscene, Kate had the Retro Lancer either in her hands or on her back. When you would open a door with a two-handed weapon, she would sling the other weapon over her shoulder or lay it down, then pick it back up. There was a phenomenal level of polish from gameplay to cutscene that carried throughout the story, and I loved it. I especially loved the dialogue between the characters that was placed in very small bursts such that you didn't have to stop and wait. You think back to God of War, you'd be rowing your boat and Mimir's telling a story and you're like, oh, okay, I want to hear this play out, and you just kind of sit there and wait. Or in Days Gone, when you're riding to the objective and mid-sentence it just stops, the story's over. They really timed out the dialogue here, and I tried to break it and I couldn't. As fast as I could go from point to point, the dialogue was either just perfect or left you enough time where there was silence before you reached the next quest objective. And I think that is brilliant. A lot of games don't do this, and I'm so happy that Gears decided to do this, because it really, really, really puts a nice bow around the entire package. And you really look at the technical aspects and just the way that the lighting and the HDR and the gunplay and the level design and the polish that went into moment-to-moment gameplay, and it's clear the Coalition really does care about this story. This is not one of those Gears of War Judgment throw-offs. This is a true story with the definitive beginning, middle, and end. We haven't seen the end yet. With Kate going through emotional struggles, but in a way that we care about, with graphics we care about, with systems that mostly work. I wasn't a big fan of Jack, but that's not a negative. It's just a piece of the game I didn't particularly care about. If I had to give this game a rating, you know I don't do ratings. This is definitely a Game of the Year candidate. This is definitely the gold standard, I think, going forward for all Xbox Studio games. I think they definitely have a hit on their hands, and it's clear that when you give a developed and passionate group of people time to explore and create their own version of a story, great things can happen. Wonderful things can happen. I'm optimistic this same level of love and polish can be seen maybe in future Xbox games. We could start getting away from the Super Lucky Tales and the State of Decay 2s, and we could start moving more towards these Gears masterpieces that I think absolutely stand toe-to-toe with the great PlayStation exclusives. And obviously, as a super fan of Halo, I'm really curious now if they can keep this momentum going forward. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this video. I loved Gears 5. There's a lot of stuff I didn't like about it, and I was very clear about those things. But the pros outweigh the cons 50-1. This is an absolute Game of the Year candidate. This is absolutely an experience that I loved, with characters that I already liked, that I like even more. I want more story in the next game, and we need to start wrapping up some loose ends. We need to make sure that this story doesn't get lost in the mindless shooting that it, even though it kind of lacked, really is these, as I mentioned, these pockets of just a lot of kind of boring exploration. We need to be driving towards something. And if it's as simple as the final scene of Gears 6 is us killing the Queen, I don't think that's going to be enough. I think we're going to need more than that. That's already been played out. But we will have to wait and see. I think the game is in phenomenal hands. I think Rod Ferguson and the entire Coalition care about this franchise. They have the backing. It's clearly a commercial and critical success. So let's keep this train rolling. I will be doing a video later on talking about multiplayer, and I'm going to be extremely critical of that. But for now, it's all loves and firm handshakes here for Gears of War 5. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this long-form video. Take care of yourselves, and until next time, I will see you guys on the other side.